Okay, regarding buildings, this is where I think we have the most trouble with using observable effects of combat operations to extrapolate assumptions about illegality. So we see in news videos images of buildings being dropped, and it looks pretty stark. I mean, you see a high-rise concrete building collapsing as a result of an attack. It's very easy to figure out who caused that building to fall. That's the party that launched the projectile, dropped the bomb, fired the artillery, whatever the case may be. But what international law really requires is an assessment of responsibility for that consequence. And oftentimes, direct cause and legal responsibility for the destruction of property or the death and injury of civilians are not the same thing. We have to be very careful about conflating these. When the enemy uses presumptive civilian objects like a building or a vehicle or a hospital for military purposes under international humanitarian law, they have transformed that object into what's called a military objective. That means it loses its protection from attack. Now, you could say, well, look at how bad the destruction is. That must have been wrong. But that's like saying 1 + I don't know equals war crime. Because if you're trying to decide whether or not an attack that results in destruction of civilian property was or was not consistent with the law, you cannot just look at the results of the attack. That is relevant information, but it's not dispositive. What you have to do is you have to say, what was the target? What was its value? What were the attack options? What level of destruction was necessary to achieve the military objective? What measures did you implement to mitigate civilian risk? You have to look at all of that together and then get to that last point that Arthur raised, which is proportionality, which is by its very definition an incredibly ambiguous term. And by the way, if I'm advising a commander and I say to a commander, you're not allowed to attack that target if you determine that the civilian risk is excessive in relation to your military advantage, what is my commander going to ask me then? He's going to say, well, what does excessive mean? And Arthur would agree with me that that's the $1 million question. I can't give you, there's no book I can open and say, this is how much this is worth. It's a moral judgment, and it's carried on the shoulders of battle commanders who have to make this terribly difficult decision. So that's why I say again that what we really ought to be focusing on is, number one, how confident are you that it was a military objective? What information did you have and what efforts did you make to confirm that information? And number two, what measures did you implement to mitigate the risk to that civilian property or civilians before you launched the attack? So just as an example, 2 examples. Let's take the rocket that hit near the hospital that the media immediately said was fired by the Israelis. That was a double violation. Palestinian Islamic Jihad launched that rocket to kill civilians. They just killed the wrong civilians. They didn't want to kill Palestinian civilians. They wanted to kill Israeli civilians. It doesn't matter. The intent to kill the civilians was the war crime. And so they intended to kill Israeli civilians. That's a war crime. They killed Palestinian civilians. That's a war crime. Or take the example of watching a building collapse and you say, well, why do you have to drop all these buildings? Where does the Hamas subway run? Where are all these tunnels? They built them under the most densely populated areas of Gaza City because they knew that in order to destroy the tunnel, the Israelis are going to have to use such high density explosives that they're inevitably going to be compelled to destroy the buildings above the tunnels. If you think of a subterranean tunnel and you collapse it, what happens to the structures on the surface? They're going to collapse. Having said that, if I were an Israeli commander, destroying these tunnels would be a very high priority because my alternative is what? Put soldiers in them? I was in some of those tunnels in 2015 that were discovered running into Israel, and I was stunned at how complex and sophisticated they were. This is not an incapable enemy. This is an adaptive enemy that has been preparing for 8 or 9 years for this eventuality. And so we have to look at the effects of these attacks and step back for a minute. And it's fine to say, I'm worried that that might have been excessive force, or I'm worried that you shouldn't have used that much destructive power on this target. But being worried or concerned about it doesn't automatically make it illegal. Unless you know all those other factors, you're speculating on whether or not the attack judgment was legitimate, legal, and necessary under the circumstances.
And of course, it's worth stressing that with respect to previous operations in Gaza, through from 2008, 2012, 2014, 2021, the consistent reporting on the basis of that analysis being conducted after the event is that Israel has maintained the requirements of the laws of armed conflict, and in many respects, perhaps even exceeded them.